right, strap in everybody. Today we're going deep on a book that's been making some serious waves, The Last Days of Manhood.
Yeah, Conrad Reichert, the author, he doesn't pull any punches.
Nope, he definitely doesn't. And, this deep dive is going to be all about dissecting his argument. We'll be looking at how he thinks societal changes and policies have, well, kind of messed things up for men and families.
And he brings a ton of historical analysis to the table. He's not just, spouting off opinions.
Right, exactly. So, Riker's main point, the thing he keeps hammering home, is this link between what he calls feminist-Marxist ideology and the decline of, traditional masculinity and family structure. Where does he, start with all that, historically, I mean?
Okay, so he points to this, big shift, right? We used to have mostly male-dominated workforces, and then things became more gender-balanced.
Yeah.
And Riker argues that this kind of led to this perception of men, holding all the power, being privileged.
Well, he says that set the stage for this idea that men needed to be, taken down a notch. Interesting. Does he tie that into, how fewer men are going to college these days, especially for things like, science and engineering?
Exactly. He brings up the drop in male enrollment in higher ed, particularly in STEM fields. And he also points to the fact that there are fewer men in leadership positions now. He even goes so far as to say that some traditional masculine traits, like being assertive or ambitious, are now being labeled as toxic.
If you're a man who wants to get ahead, you're automatically a problem.
That's kind of what he's getting at. And he doesn't stop there. He even tackles the welfare state, which, a lot of people see as a good thing.
Yeah, the safety net, helping those in need.
Right. But Riker argues that while it's meant to help, the welfare system can kind of create a situation where men aren't as essential as providers anymore.
Huh.
And he says this disrupts, traditional family dynamics. It can leave men feeling less needed, less important.
So, he's building this case that men are getting hit from all sides. But is this all theoretical, or does he actually, back it up with evidence?
Oh, he backs it up. One example, he cites this 2019 statistic from the American Psychological Association. It says that men are 3.5 times more likely to commit suicide than women.
Whoa, that's a heavy stat.
It is. And Riker uses it to support his point about societal and legal biases against men. He's arguing that men are increasingly feeling pushed to the margins, almost like they're second-class citizens.
He even brings up the 2008 financial crisis, right?
Yep. He uses it to illustrate how men, especially those who were the primary breadwinners in their families, were hit way harder by job losses. He sees it as a vulnerability of that traditional role.
Okay, so it's not just about social norms changing. He's talking about real consequences, legal stuff, economic stuff.
Right, and when it comes to the legal system, he really digs in, especially in areas where he sees bias against men.
Yeah, like family courts. I know a lot of our listeners are really concerned about that.
He doesn't shy away from it. He flat out says that men are only granted primary custody in about 20% of cases.
So he's suggesting that the system favors mothers, even when fathers are just as capable and involved.
That's his argument. And he goes beyond custody battles, too. He points to the gender sentencing gap, where men, statistically, they tend to get harsher sentences for the same crimes as women.
Wow. That's a big one, and definitely something we hear about a lot. Does he get into domestic violence laws, too?
Oh, yeah. And he's pretty critical. He says that these laws often just assume the man is the aggressor. They don't even consider that women could be the abusers. And he goes after the Duluth model, which is the standard approach in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Riker claims it's inherently biased against men because it basically focuses all the attention on male violence.
So he's laying out a case for how these biases, these assumptions, they can really screw things up for men. But what about this whole toxic masculinity thing? Does he address that at all?
He does, and it's a big part of his argument. He suggests that the whole idea of toxic masculinity is basically being used to demonize anything that's traditionally masculine. He gives examples like men being told that being assertive is the same as being aggressive, or that showing confidence is just arrogance.
So he's not denying that some guys behave badly, but he's saying we shouldn't just label every male trait as toxic.
Exactly. He even uses pop culture examples. He talks about the show Friends.
Friends, huh?
Yeah, he says the male characters are often portrayed as incompetent or clueless, especially compared to the women.
Interesting. Because it kind of circles back to his point about how people see men now. He's saying these portrayals reinforce the idea that traditional masculinity is somehow bad or outdated.
Right, and that leads into another big part of his argument, how the welfare state has impacted families.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. What is his take on that?
Well, he argues that while the welfare state was supposed to be a safety net, it's kind of become a replacement for men as providers. He uses statistics from the National Center for Family Research, showing how single-parent households, especially fatherless homes, have been on the rise.
Right, we've seen those numbers.
And he connects this trend to policies that actually encourage single parenthood through welfare benefits.
So he's saying that by trying to help, the system actually undermines the traditional family, where the father is the main provider.
Exactly. And he takes it a step further, exploring what he calls the feminization of culture, which, well, that's a whole other can of worms that we'll get into in the next part of our deep dive. All right, we're back, and we're still knee-deep in Conrad Reicher's The Last Days of Manhood. We've talked about how, he sees all these societal shifts and policies as kind of screwing men and families over. But now I'm curious, does he offer any solutions? Or is it just all doom and gloom?
Yeah, I mean, he's laid out some pretty heavy stuff. Does he offer any hope? Is there a way to fix things, according to him?
He does. And he starts by saying, look, we got to acknowledge there's a problem, right? We can't fix it if we don't admit it's broken.
Okay, so step one, awareness.
Exactly. He calls on men to recognize what he calls the war on masculinity and how this, feminist-Marxist ideology, as he sees it, has kind of reshaped everything.
So basically, he's saying, wake up, guys.
Yeah.
This is real, and it's affecting you whether you realize it or not.
Yep. He wants men to see that they're not alone in feeling like they're getting pushed aside, that there are actual forces working against them, but awareness is just the beginning.
Right, you can't just sit around and complain. So what does he say men should actually do about it?
Well, he introduces this idea of a new masculinity, embracing strength, honor, responsibility, leadership, all those traditional values, but in a balanced way. Not going back to some, caveman stereotype, but finding a way to be a man that works in today's world.
So it's not about rejecting masculinity, it's about redefining it.
Exactly. Reicher's all about men stepping up, taking charge of their lives, their families, their community. He's big on fatherhood, mentoring younger guys, being a leader wherever you are.
So, less talk, more action. But he doesn't just ignore the big picture stuff, right? The systems and policies he was criticizing earlier.
Oh, no, he definitely doesn't. Remember how he was pretty harsh on the welfare state?
Yeah, and the legal system and how men are shown in the media. Does he actually suggest concrete solutions for those? Because those are some pretty massive things to tackle.
He does. For the welfare system, he's all about reforming it. He says the way it's set up now, it often discourages traditional families and makes people dependent on the government, which, kind of undermines a man's role as a provider.
Yeah, okay.
He suggests looking at different approaches, like maybe tax breaks for married couples or programs that encourage fathers to be more involved.
Finding ways to help families without accidentally breaking them apart.
Exactly. Shifting the focus from individual handouts to policies that help the whole family unit thrive. And he takes the same approach to the legal system.
Which, if you remember, he pretty much ripped to shreds in the first part. Especially when it comes to things like family courts and sentencing guidelines. What's his fix for that?
He wants a total overhaul, start from scratch and make sure it's fair to both men and women. He points to the gender sentencing gap, how men get harsher punishments statistically, and the bias in child custody cases, where the mother usually wins. Reicher wants to see those things fixed.
So, pretty radical changes to some pretty fundamental systems.
Yeah, he's not messing around. And he knows it won't be easy, but he thinks it's crucial if we want a society where men and families can actually do well. But it's not just about laws and economics.
He also talked about how men are portrayed in culture, in movies and TV, and how that feeds into the problem. Does he offer solutions for that, besides just, changing individual shows?
He does. He thinks the church has a big role to play here, supporting family values, providing some moral guidance in a world that's becoming more and more secular.
Okay, so that's interesting.
He spends a whole chapter on it, actually, saying the church can offer support and guidance, kind of counteracting the negative stuff that's coming from pop culture.
So it's like a multi-pronged attack.
Yeah.
Changing the systems, changing the culture, and finding institutions that can reinforce these, traditional values.
Exactly. He thinks we need a total societal makeover, basically. One that rethinks gender roles, the role of government, what it actually means to have a healthy and successful society.
It's a bold vision, but it also kind of makes you wonder, is it even possible? Can we really expect to change all that?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Because next we're going to dive into Reicher's economic arguments, how he connects strong families to a booming economy, and what he thinks we need to actually do to build a better future.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the last days of manhood. And we've covered a lot, like societal shifts, the legal system, the welfare state, even how men are portrayed in movies and TV. But now I want to hear about this economic argument. Because Reicher, he makes this pretty bold claim. He connects strong families to a strong economy.
Yeah, he really does. And it's one of the, I think it's one of the most interesting parts of the book. He argues that these like traditional family structures with the man and the woman having clear roles, they're actually crucial for economic prosperity.
I mean, that's a big claim. Does he actually like back it up? Or is it just like a philosophical thing?
He uses like historical examples and data. He talks about the Amish, for instance.
The Amish. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, he argues that their family values, the way they have these clearly defined roles for men and women, and their crazy strong work ethic, all that has contributed to their economic success. Like, they've built these thriving communities, self-sufficient, even with all the pressures of, the modern world.
So he's saying, like, their traditional way of life has actually protected them from some of the bad economic stuff that's happening elsewhere.
That's what he's saying. He admits, like, it's not for everyone, their way of life, but he thinks there are important lessons there about family, hard work, community, especially when it comes to building a strong economic base.
I see what he's saying. But some people might say, the Amish are kind of unique. Not exactly a model for everyone. Does he have any, like, more modern examples?
He does. He talks about the Japanese salaryman culture, though he says, he doesn't agree with everything about it, like the long hours, all the pressure on the men.
Yeah, that can be pretty intense.
Right. But he points to their dedication to their families and their companies as a key factor in Japan's economic success.
So he's highlighting the positives, even if he sees some negatives too. The hard work, the loyalty, that kind of thing.
Exactly. He wants us to look beyond our own cultural assumptions and consider different models, especially ones that have been economically successful. But it's not all about looking at other cultures, though.
Right. Because he's pretty critical of where Western societies are heading.
He is. He thinks a lot of modern policies, especially the ones he sees as influenced by this feminist-Marxist ideology, are actually hurting family stability and economic self-sufficiency.
Okay, can you get specific? Like, what kind of policies is he talking about?
He points to no-fault divorce, for one. He says it makes it too easy to just, end a marriage. And welfare programs that, in his view, they're kind of incentivize single parenthood. He also criticizes things like affirmative action, saying it can disadvantage men in the workplace. Basically, his argument is that these policies, even if they had good intentions, they've contributed to the breakdown of the traditional family.
And he connects that breakdown directly to economic problems.
Yep. He brings up the rising costs of single-parent households, the strain on social safety net programs, and how fewer men are working, all as evidence of this economic impact.
So he's saying it's not just a social or cultural thing, it's also hurting us economically.
Exactly. He thinks we need to completely rethink how we do welfare and economic policy. He suggests looking at alternatives that actually strengthen families, encourage marriage, and support fathers in their traditional roles.
Interesting. So he's saying we need to think about the big picture. Not just individual rights, but how our choices impact families and ultimately the whole economy.
That's a great way to put it. It's like a more holistic approach, recognizing how family, culture, and economics are all tied together.
Well, I got to say, this deep dive into the last days of manhood has been pretty eye-opening. We've covered Riker's arguments about, the decline of traditional masculinity, the influence of feminist-Marxist ideology, how important strong families are, the need for legal and economic changes, even the role of the church.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I think, whether you agree with everything Riker says or not, he's definitely raising some important questions about, where we are as a society and the challenges facing men and families.
I know I'm walking away with a lot to think about, and I bet our listeners are too. For anyone who wants to dig deeper into Riker's analysis and see what he proposes as solutions, you can check out The Last Days of Manhood. It's on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It's definitely a book that'll make you think, maybe challenge some of your assumptions.
Yeah.
And hopefully get you talking about these issues.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those brains working.